Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We are live here, streaming on various some things. I don't know. I'm not a stream person. I thought a stream was something that you fished in, but apparently it's a way that you ingest media. Anyway, as you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, where we're exploring the thesis: if a 1-year-old can blow out a birthday candle, can a jet engine blow back a wildfire? Why do we want to blow out wildfires? Because they're dangerous and destructive in many cases. And exactly how dangerous and destructive they are is something that can actually be quantified economically if you're not counting all the people who get sick and die. Okay, so it's very partial. I've got Emily Hope with us today, coming all the way from the great north, the country that can't keep its smoke to itself. And Emily is a forest resource economist turned PhD student covering wildfires. Emily, welcome to the podcast. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You bet. So tell me, what are you studying now?
Oh gosh, I am, in a nutshell, studying the economics of aerial wildfire suppression in Canada.
Wow. Okay. How much of the suppression efforts are aerial by area versus by other means?
That's a fantastic question that I don't know that I can give you a statistic, but I can provide some insights.
Okay.
In Canada, it's my understanding that most management agencies have some sort of aerial fleet. So combination of rotary wing, fixed wing, and they use those tools to suppress fire, as I'm sure is very similar in the States, and use a combination of land-based retardant tankers and water-based skimmers. And
Okay.
so
So you've got a lot of
obviously,
tools there. And I say a lot of
yeah,
tools, we're talking about variety, but what about the sheer volume? Because in the US, we certainly don't have enough aerial tankers to hit every fire with them.
ooh, okay. Well, in terms of volume, again, another hard one that I don't have statistics for you on. But some provinces
You can make
have,
it up. No one knows the right answer.
and the hoping that some of my Canadian colleagues might see this and they'd be able to point out the errors.
Okay.
But some provinces have, I think Ontario has about 9 415 water bombers and a couple of Twin Otters, and then they'll hire rotary wing aircraft on contract. Whereas Alberta has a lovely mixture of land-based retardant tankers. They've got a couple of those water skimmers. They've got some smaller fire bosses. So it's this wide mixture. But the point you kind of made about whether or not it's enough, that's one of the questions that I'm really interested in trying to shed some light on. I don't know that anyone can ever really answer that question definitively, but trying to get some insights into how effective these aircraft are and, of course, the costs, I think will be really helpful, especially as we kind of move towards a future that could be a little different.
Yeah. I thought you were going to say no one really can ever have enough of them. But
That could be true too. I mean, import aircraft from other countries, build more aircraft, borrow them, all that good stuff. So maybe you never can have enough. It's kind of one of those.
I think going forward, that's going to be the situation, especially when you have wildfires going on simultaneously in different parts of the country and in multiple countries at once. The resources, I would imagine, could get pretty spread thin.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that was really came to light last year in 2023, which was a record-breaking fire season for Canada. Fires burning coast to coast, roughly the same time. So usually there's a bit of a difference as to when the fire seasons pick up speed in the country. So the West Coast might be very active at the beginning, whereas provinces more towards the center and east would see fire activity sort of deeper into the summer. And that allows for the transfer of aircraft between provinces. So we have our CIFC, the very similar to NIFC in the States, that sort of brokers some of those transfers. But last year, everybody needed their own aircraft at the same time, so there was no sharing that was easily facilitated. So that involved, bringing in other resources from other countries, and yeah, just sort of, the allocation of scarce resources is a perfect economic question.
Right, and that drives prices up, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
So I would imagine that Canada versus other countries probably has a higher need for aerial suppression simply because of the vast uncharted forests or not a
Yeah,
lot of roads and a lot of woods.
no. And you make an excellent point about the lack of roads. Some of the landscape is pretty inaccessible, and the only way to get a crew out there is to put them in a helicopter. And if you're trying to apply lots of water, well, that's where the skimmer comes in handy. One of the cool things about the country, though, is that there's a prevalence of lakes. So if you're going to be dumping water on a fire, it's pretty easy to go scoop and sort of create that continuous circuit of water bombers dumping water on a fire. So that's one of the benefits of aircraft. Now, they've been used in the context of Canadian fire management for decades. I believe one of the provinces is celebrating it's either its 100th or 150th anniversary of their air tanker or air fleet service. So there's a lot of history associated with the use of aircraft in fire management. And of course, some of these aircraft have some pretty cool Canadian roots. I believe the CL-215 and the 415 were designed and produced in Canada. So they kind of have become this iconic aircraft, and I think it's pretty cool to see them flying.
Yeah, no kidding. So given the scarcity of resources, I would imagine that you focus your resources around your man-made infrastructure and your energy infrastructure and protecting those type of assets, and then the forest is secondary. Is that the case?
Obviously, saving human lives is paramount. Community secondary, and then you sort of have that cascading where forest assets, industry, those are kind of closer to the bottom. But yeah, kind of pre-locating some of those aircraft in areas that are subject to higher hazard, areas that might be a little bit less accessible. There are a lot of ways that agencies sort of figure out where they should be pre-positioning their aircraft. And it's one of the areas that I still need to learn quite a bit about, but I do think it's very interesting because it could be, where is the optimal location for these aircraft? Where should we put the airstrips such that our tankers can land? All fascinating questions.
And so, what are the fascinating answers? Or are we just we're still wondering about the fascinating questions?
We are still wondering. I'm very early into my research, so at this point, it's really trying to get a handle on what questions are interesting, what questions are interesting to the management agencies, and what kind of data is available. So, data seems to be one of the big ones. You can get information on flight hours and the fires that aircraft were working, but trying to tie cost to those and trying to get a sense of, well, maybe the aircraft was down for maintenance and that's why it didn't fly, leads to a whole bunch of interesting implications for the economics of aircraft because they do make up a large component of annual expenditures when it comes to looking at suppression costs. So.
And what are those expenses?
Oh, well, 2023 being the example that sticks in my mind, but one province spent close to $1 billion on suppression, and that doesn't even account for the losses associated with wildfire, the cost of evacuation, the smoke health-related impacts, timber losses, which is worthy of quantifying. So $1 billion put towards suppression, or close to $1 billion, doesn't seem sustainable. And I'm under the impression that most of those costs were probably associated with equipment. So aircraft, fixed or rotary wing, heavy equipment for building fire guards, that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know that it's, sorry, go for it.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I don't know how sustainable it is to spend billions of dollars every year on fire suppression. And I have to assume the situation is maybe similar in the States.
Yeah, well, that $1 billion, is that $1 billion Canadian dollars?
That is $1 billion Canadian, so perhaps
Oh,
not quite the same in US dollars.
yeah. Okay, so not so bad.
Still,
So you're weighing out whether $1 billion a year or more for suppression is sustainable versus how sustainable is it to let the fires burn?
So to an extent, I think what I'm more interested in is whether or not we can optimize the use of the resources that we have. So is it a matter of flying aircraft earlier in the day and suppressing fires while they're a little bit quieter? Or is it a matter of looking at new aircraft that can deliver more water and presumably a greater punch when it comes to trying to suppress those fires? Or, should we be just getting more of what we have? So is it a matter of everybody should have, 50 802s and that's going to solve our problem? I doubt it. That seems like an expensive way to go and probably not useful for some provinces, but something worth thinking about.
Yeah. So how do you go about getting the data that you need in order to make recommendations?
That is a very good question. And so right now, it really involves talking to the fire management agencies. So they do occasionally have data on, the statistics associated with their aircraft. And so if I can take a peek at that, that would be ideal. If I had more time in the context of my PhD, it would be really neat to go out and actually collect some data. So go sit in a fire management center and listen and take notes and record the movement of the aircraft. That would be fantastic. But yeah, right now it's relying on those fire management agencies, and I'm hoping that they'll be interested in some of the same questions I am and be willing to talk about data, or at least give me a sense of whether or not I'm on the right track.
Yeah, I suspect you're not on the wrong track. Uh, so do you have a sense that suppression tactics and technology are something that we scale or something that we innovate? Is it the case that if you have 10 fires, you throw 10 suppression bucks at it, and if you have 1,000 fires, you throw 1,000 bucks at it of the same resource? Or do you think that a new strategy and new equipment is going to be required to that's more efficient, because you can't really scale that billion to 20 billion very easily, but the fires could easily jump 20x?
Interesting question. And I don't think that we can scale, sort of as you indicated. Like I don't think we can spend or throw $1,000 at every fire, and then if we had X number of fires, throw the exponentially large number of dollars at the same fire. So I do think it's probably going to be a combination of innovation and new technology. And so maybe that means using our existing resources in different ways, or investing in new technologies, or throwing, not, I shouldn't say throwing, putting money towards preparedness and mitigation. Or maybe it means reconsidering what it means to live in the forest. So, maybe we should be looking more at asset and infrastructure protection, or shelter in place approaches, or just instead of the pure evacuation approach. And this is just conjecture. I was still researching and trying to figure out what the right balance is. But yeah, those are some of my current thoughts on it.
So when you think fire, you're thinking, suppression, values at risk, economic cost. Are you
Yeah,
also thinking active fuel reduction in progress?
I wish I could say yes. And in like an academic sense, yes, I should be thinking of that. But right now, my gut is when I'm thinking about fire, I'm thinking about suppression, because I think that's where the interesting economic piece comes in, basically in the context of my research. What I'd like to do in the future, though, is to step back a little bit and look at that full cost plus loss plus benefit issue. So the cost of suppression, plus the losses associated with the fire, plus the benefits the fire provides to the landscape. It's more the traditional economic approach when it comes to quantifying wildfires. But as I said, right now, my research is so focused on the air tanker suppression side of it that I've kind of had to focus there and kind of draw a line in the sand as to what I'm thinking about.
I see. Well, obviously, the best way to have a place not burn is to have it already burned,
That is one
right?
thing,
So
yes.
the
Although,
pre-consuming those fuels is great, and a lot of places are looking, as you said, at beneficial fire and how that improves the the physical health of the forest. That many of the boreal forest trees require fire in order to spawn. to
Yes.
release seeds. So it's a part of the cycle. So we obviously, even if we wanted to, we couldn't repress or suppress all the fire.
No, certainly not.
What about prescribed fire and using, aerial support to keep your prescribed fire to the borders that you hoped it would stay to?
I think that's an excellent use of our suppression resources, especially if they can use that to reduce the losses associated with a larger wildfire that might roll through in the future. I kind of think you raise an interesting point here, though, that I'm very much focused on the use of the suppression resources in that one context, in terms of putting out fires that are unwanted on the landscape. It would be very interesting to take a look at the use of aerial suppression resources to support fire on the landscape. So maybe that's prescribed burning, maybe that's back burning, or other fires that are let to burn on the landscape. So just sort of the bob fires. We're just observing them.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's ever seen a movie about Vietnam understands that you can do aerial ignition of fires as well, right?
Yes.
You can drop a line of napalm, and you can very specifically start a fire where you want it. Then I imagine that you let it burn, and then you come back and suppress it at the outer perimeter.
Yeah. I imagine you could have some quite significant implications for the landscape.
So have you seen any aerial use of ignition?
I have not. In fact, my experience with wildfire is exceptionally limited. I've seen exactly one fire, and it was mostly out by the time I got there, which I guess is good. It's a good way to see a fire. But no, it's still on my list of things to do to see a wildfire, and maybe even see aerial ignition.
So do you see that you have an advantage not having had a lot of experience in wildfire, in that allows you to contemplate possibilities that people who've been doing it forever won't see?
On one hand, perhaps maybe a little bit of nativity has led me to different perspectives. But by the same token, it leads me to a lot of questions, a lot of things that I didn't understand when I first got into this sort of field. Was why are things the way they are in terms of policies, procedures, various approaches that dictate the use of aircraft? And I'm finding that as I talk to more people and get a better understanding of fire management, there are reasons behind why things have developed. Maybe it's safety. Maybe, past experiences have suggested to management agencies that, policy A doesn't work, but policy B works pretty good. So I guess not having experience with wildfires maybe led me to feel that it's okay to ask questions. And everybody I've spoken to within the fire management community so far has been absolutely fantastic. They are willing to sit down with me, answer my incessant questions, and explain the nuts and bolts of fire management. And so it's been a really great experience. And I'm still hoping for a fire, but that might have to wait for a while.
Have you had an experience where you've asked the same question to either two people in the same agency or in different agencies and gotten very different answers?
Yes, which I think is absolutely fascinating. I had no idea that the agencies were so different in that regard. My assumption was that the agencies they'll have the same problem. They're all trying to put out fire, but the approach to putting out fire is very different. Now, one example would be questions about, what should the federal government's role be? And I'm finding that there are a lot of opinions out there, understandably so. I mean, that could be, the federal government involved in firefighting could have significant implications for a lot of people. So it's been really interesting to sort of sit down and dive a little deeper into those questions, as in what are your thoughts on sort of policy A versus policy B, and finding out that the next person has completely opposite perspective has been really, really cool.
I mean, it's not the inhabitants of any given province that are responsible for the fuel load, for the number of trees and the built assets. So I could see a case for more federal support. What's the general consensus in Canada?
Well, that is a fantastic question. And, as I'm talking to people in different agencies, some people are very, very supportive, and other people think it's a terrible idea. And I wonder, I guess if I had a magic wand, I think it would be really cool to kind of create a scenario where maybe the federal government has some airplanes, and maybe those airplanes are provided to federal or provincial agencies depending on the need. I suspect that the U.S. Forest Service does something similar, although I'm not quite sure there. But
Yeah,
that could certainly be a model for the future,
right. When
especially
fires
if,
reach a certain scale, then
yeah,
FEMA steps in or U.S. Forestry.
yeah,
Right.
or maybe in Canada, as if fires start impacting X number of people, then the federal fleet comes out, which could be kind of cool.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's which people. That's what it often
Yeah,
comes down to.
yeah,
Right. Uh, we won't even go there. Yeah. Except that wildfire policies are to some degree discriminatory, and you're going to see much bigger responses in areas where the cost per acre, of housing is higher,
yeah,
because that's the way it is.
yeah. And it's very it's illuminating to sort of see some of the implications of the different coverages and how dependent it is on population density.
So, do you think that the federal government could bring, new technology through additional aircraft, uh, or do you think that the federal government manages things so inefficiently that the best use would just be to give those dollars to the provinces that are fighting the fires to take advantage of the local expertise?
I don't know that I'd say that the federal government is inefficient,
You
but
wouldn't, huh? Let
I
me
would
make a
say
note of that. There is one person who I just found who doesn't think the federal government's inefficient. It's Emily Hook.
I would say though that there might be a place for supporting new technologies. So there's a new water tank or water bomber that's supposed to be produced, and it's going to be I think it's still called the CL-515. So a bigger, better, faster water
Catchy
bomber.
name. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, right. It's got five in it. That's cool. But so the aircraft are expensive,
sure.
and maybe the role of the federal government should be to sort of help support acquisition of those aircraft. By the same token, there are other options for new aircraft. So like the Q400, the Dash 8, that's been fit with a belly tank to supply retardant. I've heard great things about that aircraft as well. Or maybe just more of existing aircraft that we already have, like the 802s. But as one of your earlier points, I don't know that we can resource our way out of more fire in the future.
Okay. So if we can't resource our way into an adequate amount of suppression within our budget, what are the other areas to explore?
Hmm. Maybe, well, I mean, I think we talked about prevention and mitigation, and instead of you know always focusing on evacuation, maybe focusing on other approaches like shelter in place. Um, that's a tricky one. If we can't just resource our way out, maybe we need to be learning to live with more fire on the landscape.
Yeah, I mean, the scale of some of those fires doesn't really look like shelter in place is always a good option or an option at
That's
all.
very true. Yeah,
Right. And I know that, as they face increasing number of simultaneous fires, they have to make decisions about,
yeah.
this town's going to burn and there's not a thing we can do about it. In fact, at
Except
one
get people
point
out of the way.
in that summer 23, they knew that they were going to lose 400 little towns. There's nothing they could do about it. All they could do was hope that they could provide, safe evacuation routes.
Yeah.
Uh, so one of the things that we hear down here is
Hmm.
that there's been a considerable reduction in Canada in the number of firefighters, just the way
Oh,
we've suffered that down here as well.
and what I've heard anecdotally is that there are major recruitment and retention issues within Canada. that seems to extend all the way through from employees that are focused on logistics through to employees or pilots and aircraft maintenance engineers. It kind of seems to be a prevalent problem. And some of the arguments are that, society as a whole is experiencing this. It's hard to find bus drivers. It's hard to find hairstylists. It kind of is everywhere. So it makes sense that it would extend to the fire management agencies. But along with that, you've also got retirement. There's a lot of experience walking out the door, which can be problematic for new people coming in, because you don't necessarily get that overlap where the newer, younger staff can learn from the more experienced staff. So that can be a bit of an issue. And the other factor might be that I'm told it's very attractive to work for airlines if you are in the aviation field. So I can understand that it might be hard for provincial government agencies to kind of compete with the private industry, especially when industry offers pretty cool perks like flying all around the world as opposed to just flying in Canada.
Yeah, right. When you're not on duty, you're not going to catch a ride with another wildfire pilot and go back to a fire.
That's right. It's not quite as attractive as a quick trip to Paris or something.
But when we say that it can't compete effectively with the free market, it can choose to do whatever it wants, right? It's the
That's
federal
true.
budget government. If any entity could compete, it would be them.
That is true. But I think there are questions about how much the government wants to spend, and I think that's true for all governments. Because if you're spending in one area, you might have to make cuts in other areas, and there are so many areas that need spending. It's hard to pick and choose where the cuts happen.
Yeah, my experience, generally fire comes pretty high on the list. If you've ever been pulled over for speeding, you might have been asked by an officer, "Where's the fire?" Because that would be considered the acceptable excuse.
Have you ever been able to respond and sort of indicate that yes, you are heading to a fire?
Yes, I pull up an app called Watch Duty, and I say, "Well, the fires are here, here, and here."
Does it work? Does it make the officer sort of take a
Not if
step
I'm not
back?
responding to it myself. No, no. But it does answer the question.
Sure.
Where's the fire? It's right here. And you could pretty much take a good guess at where the fire is going to be, because sooner or later it's going to be everywhere.
Yeah.
So I kind of divide the world into places that are on fire and places that are going to be on fire. And
Yeah, at that point you've got pretty much everywhere covered.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So the UN anticipates about a 30% growth in wildfire damage loss and acreage loss by 2050, and that probably is conservative. Do you have data on how much of that 30% is within Canada?
Oh, I'm afraid I don't. There
Are
are
the places
people.
that are burning going to burn worse, and the places that aren't burning are going to continue to be light?
It's hard to say. Some
Okay.
research that I've looked at in the past suggests that moisture patterns might be shifting. So certain areas might get wetter, certain areas might get a little bit drier. But there are people far more experienced than I looking into the science of it and how the climate forecasts are really going to play out on the forest landscape in Canada. In sort of, I guess, following along with that 30% increase, though, there's quite a bit of research that's suggesting that fire activity is going to increase. So either we're going to see more intense fires, and I don't necessarily know if that also applies to the number of ignitions, but definitely weather that's going to be more conducive to fire.
Yeah. So what we're seeing here is something along the lines of a 10% increase in the number of fires,
Okay.
and 1,500% increase in the acreage burnt. Like
1,500%.
vastly disproportional. The fires are much more destructive.
Yeah.
As they get hotter and the winds get stronger and it's drier, you just have so much more fuel and so much more rapid spread.
Yeah. And I imagine that associated with that will be significant losses in terms of, evacuations, beautiful properties destroyed, parks, health impacts associated with smoke, all that stuff.
Let me ask you about that assumption that you said, property destroyed. pre and post fire, the property is still there,
Mhm.
right? The land is not lost, and nature regenerates itself. And if you've ever been to an area, which I hope you get to do, walk through an area post fire, right after the fire, and then come back 3, 5, 10 years later, it's regenerated, it's healthier. The flora and fauna are usually back in there, within a few years. And so I wouldn't say destroyed in the sense that, it's something that's been permanently lost. It's just
Well,
been severely changed very quickly, but not necessarily for the worse in the long run.
but in the context of someone's home burning to the ground and everything, tied up in that home,
Sure.
losing that to fire must be incredibly catastrophic.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a whole other area of loss that is probably hard to quantify economically.
Yeah.
What are the easiest aspects of fire to quantify economically?
Oh, okay. Well, in the Canadian context, suppression costs are actually pretty straightforward. It's breaking down the suppression costs into sort of those components that's a little trickier. But yeah, there are suppression cost data sets out there. The next one might be trying to get a kind of an estimate of timber losses. So there are lots of statistics associated with how much fire or how much area is burned over the course of a year. And you can kind of make some assumptions about, number of trees per hectare and then the cost associated with the tree to get an estimate of sort of the losses associated with timber loss and area burned. Um, the next one is there are some good estimates out there on the number of evacuations. So I guess I should quantify this. Actually getting economic data, like at cost estimates, is a little trickier. Getting sort of quantity estimates is a little easier. So in terms of number of evacuations, number of people evacuated, number of structures burned, those things are a little easier to track down.
Okay.
Yeah.
So given that there's this monopoly game going on around the world about carbon and carbon credits,
Okay.
and that how do you convert the amount of carbon in any given hectare into direct emissions, and what's the economic value of not doing that?
Ooh, sort of managing the forest without considering carbon emissions from fire?
Yeah, if you could predict that a fire was going to go to 100,000 acres, and you stopped it at 20 because you had good suppression efforts, then you just prevented 80,000 acres of trees from becoming, airborne carbon and pollutants. So
Yes.
would that play
And
in the carbon market?
ooh, so further to that, not only if you stop the fire, but if you sort of undertake fuels management in the area in the first place, that could have a significant impact on the fire and have some carbon benefits as well. So I don't quantify that myself, but I believe there is a new carbon offset protocol that was, I think it was affiliated with the Climate Action Reserve out of California. And it's been a year or so since I've looked into this, but things might have changed. But the idea was that landowners could sort of generate carbon offset credits by undergoing fuels management and then run fire simulations over top of that to get a sense of how much fire on the landscape they'd prevent. Or I shouldn't say prevent fire, I should say that, maybe reducing the intensity of a future fire or
Yeah.
changing its outcome. So I have to assume that, if you could prevent emissions and you're paid for preventing emissions, that'd be quite lucrative.
Yeah, and a movie came out, a long time ago,
Okay.
in which there was a great line, that just said, if you wanted to understand what was going on in this particular circumstance, follow the money.
Well,
And this is, why I reached out to you with your background in forest economics, is that ultimately, economics determine everything.
it
Um,
does seem to kind of make the world go around.
yeah, right. So I wondered if it's possible to have a wildfire solution that doesn't consider the economics. I'm
Um,
doubtful.
Yeah, I think there needs to be consideration of how much we're spending and the costs, or I should say the negative impacts associated with wildfires. I don't think that anyone's ever going to say we're not protecting that town because there's no more money. I don't see that ever happening. But I do see that maybe after action reviews sort of look to how much was spent and whether or not that money was spent efficiently and effectively.
But we have lost towns, and particularly in Canada, we lost hundreds of towns. Um, I would like to think that it was because they didn't have enough resources, not because they made a decision not to spend them.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. It's not that they're going to turn off the funding because there's no funding left. It's the point where we're going to do everything we can to bring the resources, some suppression resources where they're needed.
I see. And we may have to make decisions about, where we allow people to build and where development can happen. And,
Hmm.
take your house right in the middle of an area that traditionally burns every 30 years. Don't be so surprised when it
Yeah,
burns. And
and
this
I
year's going to be more intense.
and I get the impression that there's already a movement in that direction, with insurance companies sort of refusing to insure homes in areas that are subject to high wildfire risk.
Yeah. And is that the case in Canada as well?
Um, I think we're getting there. I don't know that any insurance companies actually done that yet, but I would suspect that, given what we're seeing in the States, that it won't be long now.
Tell me about how you happen to be able to get a PhD in a wildfire related topic. How new a concept is that?
Well, actually, I am part of the fire lab at the University of Toronto. So, there's actually been quite a bit of research into fire economics, and a lot of it looks at operational research. So, optimizing the movement of detection aircraft looking for wildfires. And other work has actually looked at suppression economics in the context of aerial suppression historically. So there was some work done back in the 70s, but I think it's pretty clear that it's time for an update when it comes to looking at the costs of air tankers. Things have changed, right? There's new technologies available. There are new questions about the longevity of current technologies, and perhaps the environment has changed enough. And with climate change, it's forecasted to continue changing.
Very interesting. I mean, back in the day, aerial suppression would mean Ariel's dad, King Triton, telling her, "Don't get involved with that human." Different now. So I'm glad to see that there's good academic support, and it looks like your experience is that there needs to be more crossover and communication between the academic community and the practical wildfire community, because academics may need some dose of reality, and firefighters may need some dose of, hey, there's other ways to do this.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. Excuse me. Like I said, I've seen exactly one fire. I wonder how many other researchers out there need the opportunity to get out, talk to the management agencies, go see the fire, get a sense of what it means when they tell you the fire is beyond resources. So yeah, having that opportunity to go out and work on that communication piece between the academic side and the operational side, I think is exceptionally important.
So you're probably not going to be flying one of these aerial suppression tankers at any point in the near
No,
future. So you're
um,
you're limiting your impact to the study and efficient allocation of that resource. Are there people within the fire program that are working on new technologies at the university, new tactics, new hardware?
that's a very good question that I can't quite answer correctly. I would suspect so. I believe there has been research done in the past, like looking at, whether or not different kinds of aircraft should be incorporated, presumably aircraft that are novel to that agency. But in terms of like some of the really new stuff, like drones and new kinds of, I envision like the robot dog walking in the forest with the hose reel behind it, something like that. I don't know that there's
Yep.
any research going on associated with that.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe the robot dog with a chainsaw in its mouth
That could
would
be
be
very
just as
cool.
effective, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to have to harvest more. Many of the places that are suffering from wildfire really explain it in terms of too many trees.
Mm.
That too much suppression over the last century has led to an overgrowth of fuels, and that's why we have these, intensely hot, uncontrollable fires. So, from an economic standpoint, increasing the demand for wood products would have a healthy impact on fuel reductions.
It could be another opportunity for sort of enacting change on the landscape. But I think there are a lot of other things that need to be considered there, especially when it comes to environmental considerations. One of the primary concerns in Canada would be the habitat range for various caribou herds. So the caribou need, certain amounts of intact forest landscape, and harvesting really doesn't seem to go very well with caribou. They don't really seem to like it. So when we consider how to manage the landscape, there's so many factors that need to be sort of included in that analysis. What the solution is, I have no idea.
Yeah, right. And would the caribou prefer a managed forest to no forest?
You would have to ask a caribou.
Yeah, I don't know any caribou myself.
Me neither.
Yeah, we have elk and things like that here in Colorado, but
Are
I
the
don't think
elk a little more amenable? Are the elk a little bit more interested in the managed forest versus the unmanaged?
they seem to like pasture land as well.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, so and it could be the case. Obviously, will be the case. That we'll see evolution at work, and the landscape going to change, and some caribou will change, and some will disappear.
Yep. Yep. And there may not be a thing we can do about it.
No, right? And we may disappear.
That's
Right?
true. Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
the Earth would breathe a big sigh of relief.
everything, yeah, it would probably be just fine without us.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, make it better. Right. Super. And anything else that I didn't ask you about in your studies that you think is relevant to the fire community?
I think the one thing that's really surprised me is how much fire management is sort of business-like. I had no idea that there were hundreds of private companies out there associated with fire management. Either you're a helicopter contractor, you're providing aircraft, you're providing food for crews. I'm surprised, but I guess maybe I shouldn't be, because we talked about economics sort of making the world go round. So it's been really eye-opening to get the chance to experience and see, sort of the excuse me, the management side of fire management up close.
Yeah, and if I could afford to, I'd commission a study from you on the economics of wildfire suppression, leaning towards an idea that thousands of people make money when there's fire. They don't make money when there's no fire.
Yes.
Fire that's get put out very quickly is not very profitable.
So you may have an incentive to keep that fire burning.
Pardon me?
So someone might have an incentive to keep the fire burning.
Most people in the industry, the people who sell the retardant, operate the airplanes, sell the fuel, make the meals, provide the housing, right? So it's a situation where the economic incentives are counter to the public incentives. And not that we would ever say like, oh, you guys are dawdling because you're waiting for the overtime to kick in. But at the same time, like, economic incentives and stated goals should be aligned. And I haven't seen that in any country.
I think it would be very interesting to decouple fire management from the variability, the year-to-year management variability. Like, it's okay that fire management organizations expand and contract as fire seasons sort of ramp up or ramp down. But I'd kind of like to see sort of the funding sort of stay consistent so that you're not seeing those big changes through time.
Yeah, I don't think that the labor force needs to change based on fire season, because out of fire, I mean, we don't even really use the word fire season anymore. It's fire year. But the demand, in the high demand intervals, when
Hmm.
we're out, when we're in a lower suppression demand interval, those resources, could and probably should be used for fuel mitigation, and measures that will reduce the fire likelihood for the following season.
Hmm. Yep. Yep. You could certainly see maybe they respond to other hazards too.
Yeah, right. And that's one of the reasons it's hard to attract people, is because you can't support a family on a seasonal income.
Yeah.
So if you were a fire professional that did suppression in one time of the year and management and prevention the rest of the year, you had a steady job, it'd probably be much easier to retain people.
Yeah. I heartily
But
agree
we're
with that.
but we're a reactive, responsive society, not a proactive one for the most part,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Yeah, great. Well, Emily, I've absolutely enjoyed this hour learning more about what you're doing and studying how we drop water on fires from an economic perspective. I really appreciate you joining me, and I hope that as you uncover more information that could be helpful, that you'll rejoin me back on the show.
I would be so happy to.
Awesome. This is Emily Hope, live from Toronto. This PhD candidate. Did we say candidate or student?
Ah, for both.
Okay. A future PhD holder at the University of Toronto studying wildfire. You folks have been listening to and hopefully enjoying and maybe watching The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire. Check us out on the web at teamwildfire.com. See you at the next one. Take care.